Start now.
Yeah. Good morning. The Small Business Committee will come to order. Today's order of business is to consider the views and estimates of the Committee on Small Business for Fiscal Year 2020. These resources are a critical first step in helping entrepreneurs start and grow their business and in aiding established businesses to leverage their experience to invest in their business and employees. I will admit that we are again considering our views and estimates before there is a proposed budget provided from the administration. Unfortunately, this is becoming all too common. Nevertheless, we are here to set our priorities and expectations for fiscal year 2020 to ensure the Small Business Administration has the necessary resources and funding to modernize and strengthen its core programs on behalf of America's entrepreneurs. While the economy is healthy, much uncertainty remains. As a recent GDP report from the Commerce Department suggests, the economy is slowing. In fact, there is consensus among many economists that the forecast for this year is growing dim. Rising interest rates, increasing tariffs, market volatility, and a depressed global economy have led consumer confidence to fall. With fears of a recession growing and a Harvard economist and former Treasury Secretary estimating a 50% chance by 2020, more entrepreneurs and small business owners are looking towards the Small Business Administration and its many programs for help. That is why it is imperative that such critical programs are properly funded and at robust levels. The SBA's core programs ensure small employers and budding entrepreneurs have the financing, training, counseling, and access to the federal marketplace they deserve as they work to strengthen our economy. Today's views and estimates reiterate the committee's longstanding position to prioritize core programs like the Small Business Development Centers and Women Business Centers rather than expending critical funding on untested agency-initiated programs. In order to support the SBA and its mission and to leverage the success of current programs, such as the SBA's flagship 7A lending program, the agency requires our commitment to provide the requisite resources and funding levels. Today's proposal carries forward this commitment, but at the same time recognizes where improvements and increased oversight are needed. It is a priority for this committee to take a renewed look at the entrepreneurial development programs to maximize their effectiveness by modernizing the programs. In doing so, we can deliver better results for the millions of entrepreneurs utilizing the SBA resources and that of its resource partners. Finally, we all must work together to level the playing field in lending and federal procurement opportunities for socially and economically disadvantaged business owners all over the country. We can achieve this through a greater emphasis on hiring more contracting personnel and providing them with adequate training in order to effectively assist small contractors competing in the $500 billion federal marketplace. The budget we are proposing will breathe new life into the SBA. More importantly, it will provide tangible benefits to small businesses and make sure taxpayers get a positive return on their investment. At this point, I will yield to the ranking member, Mr. Chabot, for any comments he may have on the committee's views and estimates.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and good morning to everyone who's here. I want to thank the Chair and her staff for working in a bipartisan manner on the budget views and estimates. I appreciate her willingness to work collegially as we meet our responsibilities to small businesses all across the country. According to the latest economic numbers, the U.S. economy is continuing to improve, and economic forecasts are strong. In our congressional districts back home and in hearings here in Cincinnati and in Washington and all over the country, we hear from small business owners that they're optimistic about the future. There are fewer regulations from Washington, and they have more money to invest in their businesses because of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. However, small businesses are still finding it difficult for access and capital. The Small Business Administration, the SBA, and its programs are key to helping small firms expand, create jobs, and grow our economy. These programs help small businesses to access capital, provide counseling and training, and link entrepreneurs with mentors. The SBA, in short, is vital to their success in many instances. Our job is to ensure that the SBA's programs are working efficiently and effectively. We must insist that they are transparent and making the best use of taxpayer dollars. I often say that every small business starts as an idea. America is a nation of creators, inventors, and risk takers. Our economy was structured to be driven by entrepreneurs, and in fact, most net job growth is from startups and new businesses. Under Administrator Linda McMahon's leadership, the SBA has made progress in delivering its services and ensuring that it is offering the services that small businesses need. She has traveled across the country, visiting all 68 SBA district offices, and she listens to the SBA employees and she listens to small businesses. Again, I want to thank the chairwoman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back, and I thank him for his remarks. Are there any other members who wish to be recognized for a statement on the views and estimates on the priorities of the committee for fiscal year 2020? Seeing no members, the committee now moves to consideration of the views and estimates. The clerk will read the title of the document.
Views and estimates of the Committee on Small Business on matters to be set forth.
I ask unanimous consent that the views and estimates be considered as read and open for amendment in its entirety. Does any member seek recognition for the purpose of offering an amendment? Seeing no amendments, we will move on. And the question is on adopting the views and estimates on the priorities of the committee for fiscal year 2020. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and the views and estimates are agreed to. I will now recognize the ranking member for the purpose of making a motion.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I would move that the minority members of the committee be permitted to offer additional views and estimates on the budget for fiscal year 2020.
Thank you. Without objection, so ordered. And the committee is authorized to make technical and grammatical corrections to the views and estimates. And I believe that concludes the business before the committee today. So if there is no further business to come before the committee, we are adjourned, and the committee will stand in recess for a few moments to prepare for the committee hearing. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good job.
In case Angie Craig comes, she's our newest member, I have this for you.
So we have a statement for Angie Craig, who's joining us.
She's here, right?
She's right there.
So when do I do this?
You could do it right at the onset.
At the beginning?
Yeah, and just say good morning, and
Yeah.
right before you open your Senate statement, and say, hey.
Yeah. This is of Global HR.
Yep.
Okay. Good morning. So, can we get the ranking member to take his seat? He doesn't hear me. Good morning. The committee will come to order. I want to thank everyone for joining us this morning, and I want to especially thank the witnesses for being here today. I would like to welcome Ms. Angie Craig from Minnesota to our committee. Her experience as a small business investor and the former head of global HR for a major Minnesota manufacturer brings a unique perspective to the issues important to Main Street businesses all over the nation. Welcome. Whether it is the ports we rely upon to transport our goods to the utility system that power our factories, maintaining America's infrastructure is fundamental to a robust economy and to the nation's competitiveness. The topic of infrastructure is vast, encompassing networks of highways, bridges, and waterways that span thousands of miles across America. As a nation, we have a proud legacy of pushing the boundaries of innovation. Historically, America's robust infrastructure network has fostered strong economies and allowed us to be both competitive and efficient. Today, we have built telecommunications and broadband systems that connect us in a matter of seconds. However, by many measures, we are failing to keep up with the growing demands of our modern society, whether it's the high-speed internet connection that has not yet reached our rural communities, to the outdated and crumbling tunnels that connect our cities. Decades of neglect and lackluster investment have allowed our infrastructure to fall apart and fall behind other advanced economies. Let us be clear, this has all come at a cost to commerce and small businesses. That is why we must now address this issue head-on. Today, we're here to think big about the countless ways in which our infrastructure impacts the small business sector. We know that investments in infrastructure promote future economic opportunities for American workers and small businesses. In fact, 61% of the jobs directly created by infrastructure spending will be in the construction sector, 12% in the manufacturing sector, and 7% in retail trade. That is 80% in these three sectors alone. Most importantly, 90% of these jobs are good-paying middle-class jobs, many of which are supported by our nation's small businesses. From construction to engineering to architecture, small businesses are critical to maintaining and expanding our infrastructure systems. And yet, we must level the playing field to ensure that any federal infrastructure plan includes opportunity for small business owners, and particularly for women and minority-owned businesses. All of us have an obligation to ensure there is adequate federal infrastructure investment and guarantee our nation's long-term competitiveness in the global economy. Accordingly, a robust and well-planned investment in our infrastructure should benefit small businesses, both as end users of these networks and by creating business opportunities for them. It is my hope that today's discussion can help identify strategies for accomplishing that goal. With that, I thank each of the witnesses for joining us today, and I look forward to your testimony. I would like to yield now to the ranking member, Mr. Chabot, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And during my tenure as both the ranking member now and in the past as chair of this committee, I know that we've heard from small businesses from all across the country in this very room about the importance of repairing our nation's infrastructure and how important it is to those small businesses and to many others across our country. And I'm glad that we're continuing that conversation here today, so I commend you for doing that. This is an issue that stretches across every state and across every congressional district. I'm willing to bet that every member on this side of the aisle and on the other side of the aisle can think of at least one urgent infrastructure project in his or her district that they'd love to have fixed today. I know that I can, and one of the witnesses here is going to be addressing that shortly. There are many important projects in Ohio, but one I can think about in particular is it's the Brent Spence Bridge. This bridge connects Ohio to Kentucky and carries an estimated 172,000 vehicles on Interstates 71 and 75 every day, more than double its intended capacity. Today it's labeled functionally obsolete by the U.S. Department of Transportation. My district's challenge is, however, not unique. Currently, an estimated 20% of federal roads provide poor ride quality, and 25% of our nation's bridges are functionally obsolete, as is the Brent Spence Bridge. On average, the typical American commuter loses 42 hours of valuable, productive time each year to traffic alone. So that's essentially an entire work week just sitting in traffic. Some districts, obviously, it's harder than others. If you're in Washington, D.C., or you're in New York, or probably a lot of districts in California, it's particularly bad, but it happens all over the country. I'm sure the chairwoman has experienced this a time or two in her home district in Brooklyn or Lower Manhattan. So we can all obviously relate to this. At this committee, we've learned in past hearings another issue, broadband deployment, is also a crucial part of our nation's infrastructure, particularly for entrepreneurs in rural areas. I know that our colleague from Mississippi, Trent Kelly, has brought that up to me a number of times. As business owners continue to move to a more global marketplace, access to broadband is crucial to keeping small businesses competitive. Unfortunately, too many small businesses still lack access to broadband internet service considered fast by the FCC. As with any major project, it's critical that small businesses are not left out of the conversation. With small businesses creating about 70% of the new jobs in the economy every year now, they will be a driving force in revitalizing our nation's infrastructure system. We also must be sure to engage state and local governments. States and localities know the needs of their communities best, which is why any federal legislation created by this Congress must empower local governments to be leaders in their communities. I look forward to hearing from our witness panel here today, if I ever stop talking, and their ideas for moving our nation's infrastructure into the 21st century. So thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chabot. The gentleman yields back. And if the committee members have an opening statement prepared, we will ask that they be submitted for the record. I would like just to take a few minutes to explain the timing rules. Each witness gets 5 minutes to testify, and the members get 5 minutes for questioning. There is a lighting system to assist you. The green light will be on when you begin, and the yellow light comes on when you have 1 minute remaining. The red light comes on when you are out of time, and we ask that you stay within the time frame for the best of your ability. I now would like to introduce our witnesses. Our first witness is Ms. Terry Williams. Ms. Williams serves as the director of the University Texas San Antonio Institute for Economic Development Procurement Technical Assistance Center. As director, she provides direction, management, and oversight as part of the UTSA Institute for Economic Development. The program provides counseling, training, energy audits, and human resource, sustainable business, and other support services to small businesses. I welcome you. Our second witness is Mr. Tim Donovan. Tim Donovan is the Senior Vice President of Legislative Affairs for the Competitive Carriers Association, the nation's leading association for competitive wireless providers, and stakeholders across the U.S. In this capacity, he leads the association's legislative advocacy before policymakers on issues impacting the competitive wireless community, including roaming, universal service, spectrum policy, device availability, broadband policy, and others. Our third witness today is Ms. Rosalind Bucher. Ms. Bucher is the president of A.D. Marble, a woman-founded environmental and engineering firm based in Pennsylvania. Ms. Bucher is responsible for the functions and operations of the company, including marketing, budgeting, building, and maintaining client relationships, and the development of employees. Raised in San Juan, Puerto Rico, Rosalind went on to attend Cornell University and Nova Southeastern University in Fort Lauderdale. Welcome. And now I yield to our ranking member, Mr. Chabot, to introduce our final witness.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Our final witness today is the Honorable Chris Knockelman, Judge Executive for Kenton County, Kentucky, which is just across the Ohio River, which is actually, by the way, mostly owned by Kentucky, and he's in the northern Kentucky area. Judge Knockelman also serves as the president of OKI, the Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana Regional Council of Governments, the organization that oversees all federal dollars spent on infrastructure in our region. He and his wife are also the owners of Schneller Plumbing, Heating, and Air, a small business founded all the way back in 1928, and we thank you for testifying today.
Ms. Williams, now you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Chairwoman Velasquez, Ranking Member Chabot, members of the committee, good morning. I've already been introduced, so I'm going to, in essence, to try to stick to my time. Over the past 30 years, I've been involved in listening to the needs of small business owners and providing solutions. Today, key issues have been identified as infrastructure, broadband, cybersecurity, government contracting opportunities, and access to capital. My testimony is focused on these issues and some anecdotes of small business owners who continue to struggle toward success. Small businesses continue to be the driving force of our nation's economy. According to the most recent SBA Small Business Profile of 2018, 30.2 million businesses meet the definition of small, which accounts for 99.9% of all U.S. businesses. They also employ 58.9 million people, which accounts for 47.5% of total employees, and are responsible for creating 1.9 million net new jobs. Small businesses also hire 43% of all workers in the high-tech sector and produce 13 times as many patents per employee as large firms in high-tech industries. However, this cannot continue to be sustained or increased without investment in infrastructure to help small businesses be competitive with their counterparts. Broadband has become an essential tool for doing business. It is important for connecting with customers, working with suppliers, enabling remote access to employees, and improving operations. It's a critical component in competing locally and globally. According to a report of the State Broadband Initiative of New Jersey, in order for small businesses to adopt broadband, 3 areas have to be considered: availability, affordability, and adoption. Availability must consider 2 important factors: is the infrastructure to deliver broadband available and accessible at their location? Does the available broadband meet the security needs of the small business? And then affordability must consider, is there a need for upgrading the infrastructure or expanding it to the location? Is it affordable? Can the small business afford the technology, devices, equipment, applications needed to adopt the use of broadband into their operation and business? And can they afford to train or hire new staff for implementation? Finally, adoption considers knowledge and how to adopt it into their business, effectively integrating it into their operations and realizing the benefits. For many businesses in rural areas of the country, broadband is not an option, which leaves them unable to comply with electronic submissions to register their business, submit a bid or proposal, receive payments, or meet data security requirements. In an effort to address national security issues, the DoD has identified a need to increase the number of businesses who are resilient and compliant with cybersecurity requirements and decrease the vulnerability of the supply chain. Requirements are now included in many DoD acquisition documents for businesses to have a system security plan consistent with the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Unless small business owners are equipped with human and financial resources to comply with these standards, they will be left behind in the federal contracting market. In an effort to respond to the need, UTSA has developed a small business cybersecurity training academy for the purpose of helping small businesses develop a system security plan. As a result, however, this training does not provide relief to cover any necessary costs for equipment upgrades. As a result, small businesses are limited in government contracting as a primary contractor or vendor, as well as a subcontractor. Over the past 30 years, federal, state, and local government agencies have strategized at the request of small business owners to provide information and assistance in responding to requests for government contracting bids and proposals. The remainder of my testimony speaks to access to capital as well, and we know that the support of small business financing mechanisms that relax total dependence on high credit scores and lowers interest rates will help businesses be more competitive and infuse money back into their business. So thank you for the opportunity to share this information, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Williams. Mr. Donovan, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Velasquez, Ranking Member Shabbat, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify about the importance of broadband connectivity as Congress continues its work to revitalize our nation's infrastructure. CCA is the nation's leading association for competitive wireless providers, representing nearly 100 carrier members as well as vendors and suppliers. The vast majority of CCA members are small businesses or work closely with them. They invest in their hometowns, not only through providing wireless service, but also by employing their neighbors, sponsoring local events and hometown teams, and hosting community service events. Robust broadband networks are vital infrastructure for the 21st century, particularly for small businesses and the consumers they serve. These businesses rely on connectivity to provide a digital storefront to reach customers in their communities and around the world. In addition to connecting consumers, wireless services revolutionize how entire industries operate. From telehealth to precision agriculture, distance learning, and the Internet of Things, these and other services are economic multipliers and job creators that depend on reliable broadband coverage. While critical for today's mobile economy, the potential benefits and capabilities of next-generation and 5G networks will supercharge existing services and enable new technologies. The possibility of a fully connected world is both groundbreaking and exciting. But this generational leap of technology and the very existence of 5G is not inevitable, particularly in rural America. While 5G buzz grabs headlines, too many rural areas and small businesses remain on the wrong side of a persistent digital divide. Decisions made by policymakers today can either launch innovation and economic growth or exacerbate insufficient access, leaving rural America behind. Small businesses depend on policies that preserve and expand wireless services. To determine where services are available, Congress must have reliable coverage maps. Unfortunately, based on your own experiences, members of this committee know that coverage is frequently overstated, leaving consumers frustrated and small businesses lacking connectivity. This is a cornerstone issue which must be addressed. In addition to developing reliable data, Congress should act on 3 key policy issues: funding, spectrum, and deployment challenges. First, additional funding will preserve and expand wireless broadband coverage. CCA commends the FCC for making support available through Mobility Fund Phase 2 program. However, additional resources are necessary to ensure that rural areas have access to reasonably comparable services as those provided in urban areas. As Congress considers legislation to rebuild America's infrastructure, CCA strongly supports employing all policy options to advance deployment, including providing direct funding to build broadband infrastructure where private capital alone is not sufficient to support a business case for service. Next, spectrum is the invisible infrastructure for wireless service and the lifeblood of our industry. All carriers must have access to spectrum at low, mid, and high frequency bands to provide the services their customers depend on and the capacity necessary to support innovative applications. As small businesses increasingly rely on wireless broadband connections, the demand for additional spectrum resources grows exponentially. Finally, carriers must have certainty regarding the costs and time necessary to deploy towers, small cells, and the fiber required to backhaul tremendous amounts of data. Wireless services depend on this physical infrastructure, and smart policies to deploy, maintain, and upgrade these networks are key components to both closing the digital divide and completing the generational upgrade to 5G. While Congress and the FCC have taken important steps to streamline siting approval and permitting processes, additional work remains. It is important to underscore that these reforms need not pit wireless carriers against the municipalities and states that they serve. Smart policies can create a win-win scenario that saves resources by eliminating unnecessary reviews for both carriers willing to invest in network deployments as well as state and local government agencies seeking to upgrade services for their constituencies. Modern wireless services will revolutionize how small businesses connect with their customers while creating new jobs and allowing anyone to work from wherever there is a broadband connection. The services enabled by wireless broadband would not long ago be considered science fiction, but today's networks are making them a reality, improving opportunities for small businesses and reducing their costs. 5G services promises an immediate and expansive impact on the lives of all Americans, but absent smart and swift action from policymakers to close the digital divide, those in rural areas will be sidelined from a connected future. I appreciate this committee's attention to ensuring that all small businesses have the national infrastructure in place to survive and thrive, and reliable broadband is an increasingly important component to achieving this goal. Thank you for holding today's important hearing, and I welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that you are timely sticking to the 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Donovan. And now, Ms. Boher, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Velasquez, Ranking Member Chabot, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. As Chairwoman Velasquez indicated, I am the President and CEO of AD Marble, an environmental and engineering firm with 50 employees across 4 offices in Pennsylvania and Maryland. Our headquarters are located in King of Prussia, just outside Congresswoman Houlihan's district. Our firm conducts natural resources, cultural resources, and engineering, environmental engineering services on a range of transportation, water, and site development projects. Our environmental services focus on the completion of NEPA clearances and the environmental permitting process. I am here on behalf of the American Council of Engineering Companies, ACEC, the business association of the nation's engineering industry. ACEC is a national federation of state and regional organizations representing more than 5,600 engineering firms and 600,000 engineers, surveyors, architects, and other specialists nationwide. Nearly 3/4 of ACEC members' firms are small businesses. This is a timely hearing because we believe Congress has a unique opportunity this year to pass major infrastructure legislation to modernize the nation's transportation, water, energy, and communications networks. Federal infrastructure programs are essential to small businesses. Most importantly, they provide resources in partnership with state and local governments who are directly responsible for maintaining and improving infrastructure systems. These public agencies are primary market for small engineering firms. For example, approximately 85% of my company's work comes from transportation clients in the state of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Delaware. State and local agencies rely on consistent multi-year federal funding in order to plan and implement their projects. Without this funding, they can only undertake the most basic maintenance and short-term fixes and cannot effectively implement a long-range improvement plan that would unlock business opportunities for small firms. Although it's not in the jurisdiction of this committee, I would be remiss if I didn't specifically mention the need to restore long-term solvency to the Highway Trust Fund. The user fees were last raised in 1993 and have lost over 40% of its purchasing power. More than $140 billion has been transferred from the general fund into the Highway Trust Fund since 2008 because of the failure to address systemic funding shortfalls with real revenue solutions. It is time for Congress to provide new sustainable revenue for surface transportation programs. Another advantage of infrastructure investment is that federal funds are directly invested in physical assets that create a lasting benefit for the public and spur additional economic growth. In addition to the construction activities that provide local businesses with direct contracting opportunities, the flow-down effect helps bolster other economic activity as well, such as service industry, retail, manufacturing, among others. Conversely, as a small business leader and owner, I have seen how challenging the lack of infrastructure funding can be to our industry. It is more difficult for my firm to retain employees if there is no work available. We cannot afford to keep employees that cannot build to projects, even when the lull may be short-term. When there is no work, we must make quick and difficult decisions when it comes to personnel. This is a problem that affects engineering firms of all sizes, but is particularly problematic for the smaller specialty firms like mine that lack the resources and markets that enable larger firms to keep their employees busy. Lastly, on the issue of workforce development, I think it's important to note that we don't have enough engineers in this country. According to the most recent quarterly ACEC survey of company executives, more than 1/3 pointed to the lack of engineering talent as the greatest threat to their firm's success. As experienced senior staff are retiring at a rapid pace, we're not backfilling that gap with enough graduates in engineering. Firms of all sizes are fighting to attract and retain experienced engineers. This national workforce challenge does not have a silver bullet solution. It involves a multifaceted strategy, including improvements in K-12 STEM education, incentives for engineering students at the collegiate level, as well as worker retraining initiatives and increasing the number of employment-based visas for high-skilled workers. On behalf of ACEC and the nation's engineering industry, I want to thank this committee once again for focusing attention on this important issue. I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Boyer. And Mr. Knuckleman, you are recognized for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and committee members. Good morning. As noted before, my name is Chris Knuckleman. I'm a Kenton County, Kentucky Judge Executive and President of the OKI, the Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana Regional Council of Governments, and a 180-member board. It is an honor to appear before you to discuss the vital importance of reliable transportation infrastructure on all businesses, particularly small business. I am a small business owner. As you heard, our family business was started in 1928. My wife and I, by the way, with help of an SBA loan, acquired it in 2011. And by the grace of God, creative work of our team, and our business growth has now gone to over 64 employees. We're located in Greater Cincinnati with offices in Cincinnati and in Ohio and in Kentucky. All of us live in a global economy with trillions of transactions in millions of markets, driving commerce in every corner of the world. However, any accurate reading of data will show that almost all economies, and certainly the United States economy, is driven by small business. In the United States, small business is the growth engine for jobs and critical to our place on the world economic stage. You know this. Small business encompasses 99.7% of United States employer firms, half of all employment, 60% of all new jobs, 98% of all exporting firms, and 46% of private sector output, and the list goes on. As competitors in the world economy, all businesses, particularly small businesses, need to get their products to their customers in the most efficient way possible. The transmission of goods is dependent on adequate transportation infrastructure, particularly sound, effective roads and bridges. Alarmingly, our country's transportation infrastructure is in such poor condition that it is stifling our economy. The facts are frightful, and again, you know this. Over 70,000 bridges are structurally deficient. 40% of the urban roads are congested. We waste $160 billion due to congestion every year. And the problem is not just economic. 30% of all accidents are the result of poor road conditions, and highway deaths in this country have risen now to over 40,000 per year. The country's infrastructure network problem is so large, it is estimated it would take $1 trillion just to bring it up to standards. While the burden of our deteriorating infrastructure affects all businesses and their employees, it falls most heavily on small businesses. Small businesses like mine are least able to absorb the impacts of road delays on fuel costs and wasted time. Small businesses, almost by definition, are closer to their customers than larger companies. And the currency of small business is not only the American dollar, but the trust I must have with my customers who live on our streets, in our communities, in my neighborhoods, and around my region. If our employees are stuck in traffic and cannot be on time for appointments, my customers can easily find my competitors by pressing a button on their cell phones and getting them out there if they're down the street. If my fuel costs and other costs rise because of wasted time in traffic, I cannot just pass them on to unknown stockholders. My employees, my wife, and I bear the brunt of lost dollars due to poor infrastructure that we cannot reinvest in our community. In my part of the country, we have one of the nation's most critically needed infrastructure projects, the Brent-Spence Bridge. Maybe you've heard of it. The Brent-Spence Bridge does cross the Ohio River at Cincinnati into my home county in Kentucky. However, it also connects Michigan to Miami and other points north to south because it is the linchpin of I-75 and I-71 trade corridors. The bridge was constructed to carry 80,000 vehicles a day and now carries over 160,000 vehicles a day, and I can see them from my office. It was engineered over 50 years ago to handle 3,000 trucks per day and now carries over 30,000 trucks per day. Years ago, the safety side lanes were removed, making a simple lane change a dangerous maneuver, and the cost of congestion caused by the bridge is approaching $1 billion a year. The value of the Brent-Spence Bridge to our nation and to our region is obvious because over this bridge, $1 billion of freight passes every day. The Brent-Spence Bridge is the poster child of the aging and inadequate infrastructure in our country, and federally and state officials have been there regularly to use it as a backdrop to know that we have to make a change. I'd like to thank Congressman Shabbat especially for all he's done over the years to put the needs of the Brent-Spence Bridge front and center in front of Congress. And if you look at the traffic on the Brent-Spence Bridge, you'll not only see hundreds of semi-trailers, but you'll see thousands of panel trucks and service vehicles just like mine. Every day, those small trucks, carrying so much of our region's and nation's economy, fight thousands of hours of delay to get to our customers. I thank this committee's working on behalf of small business, and I want to let you know that I'm here ready to help you in any way possible in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and we really appreciate all you have to share with us today. I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes, and I would like to start with Mr. Donovan. For carriers, both large and small, build-out in rural areas is often prohibitively expensive. What can be done to help carriers remain competitive in this area during possible infrastructure expansion?
Thank you for the question, Chairwoman. You're correct that in some places, after 30 years of building wireless networks, places that still aren't served are likely because there is not a business case to build out those networks with private capital alone. The FCC does have the Universal Service Fund to provide some assistance, but that's not enough to close the size of the gap that we have. As you continue your work on an infrastructure package, we'd strongly urge you to include dedicated funding to make sure that we can close the digital divide.
Other than cost that you discussed with us this morning, what are the largest current barriers to rural broadband competition and access?
So there are additional factors that, other than direct spending, that can make builds more expensive or take more time. That includes the permitting, the process, moving through that. Access to federal lands is particularly important in rural areas, as so much of rural areas is federal lands. So working with the relevant agencies to get approval so that carriers can have the confidence and the certainty to put their capital to work to build out these networks.
Thank you. Ms. Williams, as agencies continue to identify and prioritize cyber standards, it is very likely more procurement obligations will be implemented because the energy grid is related to our nation's infrastructure and also vulnerable to cyber attacks. What can we do to ensure small contractors are best situated to evolve to new cybersecurity guidelines?
Thank you for that question. I think the best thing we can do is to keep conducting specific training events, outreach events, continue that one-on-one guidance for them, because a lot of the perception is that they have to invest enormous amounts of financing and monies to get their systems secure, but not knowing or not having all of the information that of things that they can do as far as training their employees, having adequate processes in place that they can do themselves is critical to them in complying with the requirements.
Do you feel that the Small Business Administration is doing enough in the area of education and providing information to small businesses so that we empower them with the information they need?
I think they've been doing a lot in providing specific webinars or specific some training events. But again, what I've been finding is that the small businesses really need a lot of hand-holding, and that's where specific areas can help with that.
Thank you. Ms. Bucher, energy and infrastructure are inherently linked together, and existing electricity infrastructure is aging rapidly. And arguably, the United States' energy problems are largely rooted in its crumbling infrastructure. An influx of investment must be considered in order to prevent additional weather events from exacerbating its delicate state, as we saw in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. What steps can we take now to modernize our energy grid, and how can that further the growth of the small business sector?
Thank you, Chairwoman. I think that it goes all back to infrastructure and how are we utilizing the right modern, up-to-date, latest, innovation? Are we really thinking ahead to try to create an infrastructure that it can prevent or at least reduce the level of impact that these mostly, for the most part, natural disasters are bringing? There's very little we can do to control that and to control the intensity, but there is a lot more than we can do to create infrastructure systems that can withstand, if not reduce, the level of impact.
Thank you. And my time has expired, and we will do a second round. And Mr. Knuckleman, I will have my first question to you. Now I recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Judge Knuckleman, I'll go with you to begin with, and not surprisingly, I think I'll talk about the Brent Spence Bridge. So, sure. Could you, and we've talked about that, we've worked on it for a long time, and when I say we, I mean all levels of government. I think we've gotten $53 million so far. Most of that has gone into engineering studies, EPA studies, and kind of the preparations for it. But could you remind us again, and this not only affects the folks, obviously, in my district and in the greater Cincinnati area, and all the way up to Michigan and probably into Canada as well, but also the folks on the other side of the Ohio River in Kentucky, where you're at, but all the way down to Florida. Could you remind us what actually replacing the bridge, what the direct and indirect impacts would be to the communities in our area, and then if you want to touch on small businesses as well, how it would affect them, since we're the Small Business Committee?
Sure. Well, and I think one important note that we think about this bridge in our region as being the replacement bridge. I think it's important for everyone to remember the existing plan for that the design has been done is to actually keep the existing bridge, right, not waste it, refurbish it, and add a companion bridge next to it. So the good news is past dollars of decades ago would not be wasted. They're just improved. And then the access through that entire region, which is the project is estimated to be a $2.5 billion project today. What it would actually include about a 15 to 20 mile swath of expressway that also needs to be expanded through that community, which obviously ties in one of our key airports, CBG in Cincinnati, which happens to be in Kentucky. Amazon Prime has just relocated or is going to be growing a $1.5 billion project there for their regional
now, just to clarify that, we're not talking about taking away
No, absolutely not. This was well before
yeah, okay.
your projects.
I wouldn't want to upset the chair now, since she's chair now.
And but Amazon had announced a large expansion at our airport in Cincinnati, and so we're talking about major infrastructure, national importance to get product and services, as well as the wonderful thing about what's happening with that project is small businesses are there to serve them. So we have small carriers in our area who are actually serving the future Amazon Prime with their own freight businesses. So we see that impact. We see the economic impact. We see the improvement opportunity that infrastructure can make into the cities and the counties and the community, as well as the quality of life that we see improving just because people are able to get connected to their across the state. So it's needed, and of course, where our hope is that we never see an issue where, like Minneapolis, where we have something catastrophic happen. We'd rather be proactive.
Thank you very much. And I just to conclude, one thing I wanted to mention, I'm sure you're aware of this. We, and when I say we, again, not just myself, other members here on both sides of the aisle, have been successful in getting something called projects of national and regional significance into the previous transportation bill. So there's there's a pot of money there waiting. It won't fund the whole thing, but a significant part of it. But the local communities, obviously, and Ohio and Kentucky have to determine how they're going to come up with a local part of the funding, and that's kind of been the challenge in recent years. Thank you very much. Ms. Williams, let me turn to you. Could you elaborate on the challenges, and we've talked about this in this committee a lot over the years, that small businesses face that comes from the cybersecurity threat, and what kind of impact there can be on a small business if they are successfully hacked?
So we've had, well, when I say we, UTSA, now Procurement Technical Assistance Center office services many small businesses. A lot of times they don't come to us as a resource until they've been hacked. Mm-hmm. And that's when, they'll come to the training or come to the classes, and they'll talk about the impact of them being hacked and losing all of their customer information, or making their customers vulnerable to having their information out there and stolen. And at some point, or at one point, they literally will have to shut down their business because all of their records have been compromised. So it's a great impact when they've been hacked.
Thank you. My time's about ready to expire, and I would just note that I know we've heard testimony that there's a pretty high percentage of small businesses that literally go out of business after they just can't survive. So it can be a very serious and devastating event, and I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back, and now I recognize Ms. Finkenauer, Chairwoman of Subcommittee on Rural Development, Agriculture, Trade, and Entrepreneurship, for 5 minutes.
I always do that. Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to our guest here today as well. I really appreciate you being here and talking about this very important topic. I get very excited talking about transportation infrastructure. I also, besides having the honor to sit on the Small Business Committee, I sit on the Transportation Infrastructure Committee as well, where March is going to be Infrastructure Month. So I am very hopeful we can actually start moving forward here, and it's incredibly important that we do. I'm from Iowa. We actually have the most structurally deficient bridges in the entire country. On top of that, we rank number 39th in broadband connectivity, which is a problem when I'm from Iowa and our agriculture economy, our farmers are relying on cloud-based services and the internet to be able to use precision ag the way that they need to be able to save money and, again, be able to do what they need to do in the field. Along with that, we are also desperately trying to grow rural America, and a big part of that is making sure that we have broadband in all parts of my state. And so this is something, again, I'm really excited to talk about. And Mr. Donovan, I know this is really kind of your wheelhouse as well. And want to know, I've been having a lot of conversations about this lately, and we all know there are areas of our country where we desperately need broadband. We need to expand it. But for example, I just had the National Association of County Administrators in the other day, and one of their things is, we know we need it. We don't always know exactly where because of the FCC data. And so one of the things they've been doing. You know, that there was somebody who had an app showing, you know, depending on where you're at in the county, or you can use your app and that data will go in and you can see what your connectivity is and your download speeds, which is creative and a good idea. But what more do we need to be doing, especially on the federal level here, to make sure that we have the data we need to know where we need to be expanding? I know one of the things I'm working on right now is a bill that would address some of these issues, but I want to make sure we're doing everything the right way, and wondering if you have any suggestions about what we should be looking at to make sure, again, we know exactly where we need to be investing.
Thank you. It's such an important part of the discussion, especially as these maps and what the coverage should have is going to determine where any funding is going to go and to build it out. You know, for the Mobility Fund USF, we have overstated coverage that's going to determine where $4.5 billion gets invested. You know, in December, the FCC had a different report that claimed that approximately 100% of the population lives in geography with 4G coverage. We've got to do better than that, and it needs to be more, it should be dependent on collecting better data at the FCC and the federal level instead of relying on local administrators pushing a button on an app to prove where they do or don't have service. It shouldn't be offloaded onto industry and state and local governments to prove the negative. We need to tighten up those standards and make sure we're starting with reliable data.
Great, thank you. And this one, just to shift gears a little bit, Ms. Williams, happy to have you here as well. And one of the things I get really excited about as well is making sure, again, that rural America has more opportunities, and that means getting to compete for government contracts. And so that was actually my first bill in the House, was making sure that the Small Business Administration and their procurement officers were working with small businesses to be able to compete for government contracts and research grants, which is great. But when we are looking right now at an infrastructure package that will be hopefully, again, getting done here, how do we make sure that our small businesses are able to compete for those? And is there anything else we should be doing to look out for that, to, again, make sure there's some, they're able to get these contracts?
Thank you. Great question. I think a lot of it has to do with information. With making sure that they understand the resources that are out there and that are available. A lot of times we have businesses that come to us after they have already paid a consultant to do something that's already being paid for through the federal government, through the SBA, through the Department of Defense, and being paid for in the form of having advisors and counselors available to help them navigate through the process. SBA has, or the federal government has, contracting goals. Six out of 10 of those goals consistently are met, but women-owned businesses, that goal continues to be lacking. Hub-zone business goals, that continues to be lacking. So making sure they have information is very, very important.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And,
Gentle lady's time has expired. And now we recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Balderson, ranking member of the Subcommittee on Innovation and Workforce Development, for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Like my colleague, I forget the microphone too, so I apologize. Mr. Knockelman, good morning, and thank you for being here and for representing my state of Ohio, too, with Congressman Shabbat. I also sit on the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, and I can personally attest to the infrastructure issues that we're dealing with in Ohio. And right now, Governor DeWine has just proposed, and they're doing the transportation budget work there now as we see what's going on there. I've had a chance to learn the opportunities that are out there on a national level and what's our infrastructure is facing, and I, like my colleague, agree that we need to address this issue, and that's one of the main reasons I went on this committee, because I think that it's something that we can do. What can Congress do to help small business owners overcome some of these transportation issues that you referred to with your company?
Sure, thank you, Congressman. I think that maybe one of the key factors, I think, is to really be able to listen and know that small business is willing to make an investment in infrastructure, that we're not expecting and don't look to the state or the federal government to take care of every even state and federal road. We know that we have to, our businesses generate those dollars that you are so good about making sure you dispense across the country. So I think that one of the big topics is, as you referred to, is Governor DeWine's talking about bringing up a gas tax. And I can tell you, I'll speak for myself as a business owner with literally 50 trucks on the road every day. I'm happy to invest in a gas tax that goes to roads and bridges. I know that most, if not a super majority of my friends and colleagues in my industries, those who have 50 trucks or semis, et cetera, they say the same thing. As long as it's not diverted, we want to make sure that it goes into concrete, blacktop, bridges, et cetera, to make sure that it moves our economy forward. I think that that's a message that needs to be heard loud and clear, because I don't think that infrastructure is partisan. It's we all want them, and we all know we have to pay for it. And I think that as long as it's a partnership, and I think across the levels of government, as well as among the states, and your governor and our governor in Kentucky have been, I think, working very professionally about how to present that to the public in a way that's in the business community. So I think just listen.
Thank you very much. My next question is for Mr. Donovan, and thank you for being here. And we know about broadband. We've been talking about it for a long time. I came into the state legislature in 2008. They were talking about broadband and lack of. My former Senate district is very rural, Appalachia region, and it's a weekly occurrence of not having access, small business owners in those rural communities. So, having been talking about it since before even 2008, I mean, what can Congress do to deploy this and get some, faster action? I mean, you talked about some of the regulatory processes that we have to go through and the permitting issues, and mostly with the national lands. Those are some things that we don't have to deal with in the region of the state that we're lacking. It's mostly the terrain and the hills, and I just didn't know if there's anything out there that you could suggest to us that we can do to deploy that a little bit quicker.
Sure, thank you. And the cost to deploy goes up tremendously when you're going through mountainous areas and rough terrain. One thing that there has been efforts previously is to push that in programs like the Universal Service Fund to include a terrain factor, so that if you're having flat prairie lands aren't competing for the same dollars against mountainous terrain, so that you can have some sort of bid credit or balance that out to compete on a level playing field there. Additionally, continuing to push for additional spectrum to be available for wireless carriers to deploy. I talked in my opening statement about low, mid, and high band frequencies. Low band frequencies, actually, they penetrate through obstructions and cover longer distances. So particularly in rural areas, using those signals can help you serve a greater area off of the same tower. Currently, the FCC is working on, at Congress's direction, we reallocated some spectrum frequencies from broadcasters, reimbursed them, and are using that now for wireless carrier service. That repack process is ongoing. Once that's complete, these low-band spectrum will be put to use and can tremendously help expand service availability in rural areas.
Okay, thank you very much. Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and now we recognize Ms. Davids, Congress member from Kansas.
From the great state of Kansas. Thank you, Chairwoman. And I appreciate you calling this hearing today. I also sit on the Small Business Committee and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. And so because of that, I'm becoming that much more aware of the interplay and the need to invest in kind of these core infrastructure issues in our communities. The Kansas City metro area and, my district includes Overland Park, Kansas, and Olathe and Lenexa. We've got a ton of businesses that are very dependent on things like broadband. We're also seeking to expand our reach into things like transit and that sort of thing, and all of these things are playing in together. Our area was the first Google Fiber city in the country, and Ride KC is our transit. We've got this awesome thing going on. It's got Wi-Fi on it, so it's we're trying to figure out ways to make sure that when we're doing one thing, we're also addressing another, like internet access. So when I think about how we build infrastructure that will be good for us and for our grandchildren. Certainly, broadband is at the top of mind. And so, Mr. Donovan, you said a couple of things earlier that I thought were really interesting. And obviously, broadband's a vital economic driver, and that there are lots of small firms, and you mentioned the number of smaller carriers you have, and that there are not just monetary but regulatory barriers. And specifically, you said that there were unnecessary reviews. I'm curious what you mean by that. And then I want to do a follow-up about tightening up accountability, which you also mentioned. I guess I'd love to hear about both of those two things.
Sure, thank you. So in terms of the reviews, when we're looking at that, the FCC is working on modernizing some of the review processes, but you don't need to go through the same review for a small cell the size of a backpack that goes up in an afternoon as a 200-foot tower that you're building along the side of a highway. So
and right now that review process is the same for a lot of carriers?
The FCC is in the process of implementing some changes there that are actually estimated to save about $2 billion off the cost, and that's real money that can then be put back into the networks to further expand it. For smaller firms doing this, that cost of the delay and additional fees is even more dramatic as you're operating on a much tighter margin with fewer resources to be able to put into play.
And then earlier you were talking about increasing accountability for purposes of, I believe you were talking about for purposes of what is the actual coverage, and that it would be great for Congress to have reliable maps. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Happily. So the FCC that collects data particularly for the Mobility Fund, they set standards looking at if there's an 80% likelihood that you'll have signal at a certain loading factor, the certain number of people using that tower. If you can tighten that up, include signal strength, then you have a more direct idea of where you actually have coverage without having to then have people go out and test it. We learned through that process. There's a challenge process off that initial map. And after reviewing over 20 million data points that didn't even come close to touching as much of the country that needed to be checked, the FCC found significant flaws. So they're currently investigating that, and we want to give them credit for that. But as we look at future data collections, if we can have parameters that more accurately reflect what you experience on the ground, we'll be starting off with a better map.
Okay, and then last thing, and I was hoping to ask more questions, but 5 minutes is so short. What does accountability look like? What do you think accountability looks like? What should be the consequence?
The consequence should be going back and making a measurement one time doesn't mean to be the last time. We should keep going until we have it right. What is the right map? It's what you know from traveling around your district and knowing where your dead zones are, and making sure that the data reflects that so we can set policies to fix that problem.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentle lady's time has expired, and she yields back. And now we recognize the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Hearn, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Appreciate it very much. Thanks for the witnesses for being here today. As an engineer, a lifelong businessman, and spending 5 years on the Oklahoma Turnpike Authority as the Finance Committee Chair, I certainly understand how vital infrastructure is to small business and the necessary burdens that are put on by the government to achieve the infrastructure repairs that we need to do and the costs associated with those. Ms. Boger, I'm going to get right to the questions here because I think you dealing with infrastructure and contracting with them, you certainly understand those. Could you help us understand what public-private partnerships, how those look, and what's your thoughts on those as a person dealing directly with infrastructure?
Sure. Actually, thank you for asking that question. We just recently completed, I don't know if you're familiar with the P3 bridge replacement program in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania used a P3, a public-private partnership, to complete about 556 bridges, and that is in response to the deficient bridges, the number of deficient bridges in the state, and as an effort to move that needle to the, at the right level. And we just completed the NEPA clearance for 471 of those bridges in 15 months. And so talk about the challenges with the P3 process. It's a funding alternative but there needs to be better communication from my experience, much better communication between the fund, the concessionaires and the contractors and the engineers, and so it's a big team effort. Usually these projects tend to be really timely, really with very tight deadlines, and without that communication, it could be challenging. On the more, I guess another example is the Turnpike Commission in Pennsylvania just asked us to do a clearance, environmental clearance for 270 miles, and this is related to what Mr. Donovan is also talking about, because they're looking to use the existing the existing right-of-way of the Pennsylvania Turnpike to provide broadband access, and which actually brings that they were also planning on doing that through a P3, and I recently heard that it looks like it's going to be more design build. But regardless, it's again going back to looking at what makes more sense to do as a public-private partnership and what benefits both parties will get out of that partnership, which isn't always even, and so I think there's some work that needs to be done there, but that's that would be my response.
Fair enough. So, and just continues with this conversation, as that being a possibility of how to fund our infrastructure in the future. Obviously, the private part has interest how they get repaid, their ROI on their investment, which is much different than the public side. So, keeping that thought, what do you see, as we know the Highway Trust Fund is basically loaded, or front end loaded till end of this year, and then we have a problem with funding that going forward. What do you see as some viable, maybe the most effective and efficient ways? I'm familiar with the trucking industry, would relic to see fuel being charged or upcharged, increased across the board. Are there any other ways you see?
I wouldn't give up on the public-private partnerships. I actually think that these are fairly new, at least to the state of Pennsylvania and Maryland, in my experience. I think that we can still do a lot with that type of agreement, with that type of partnership. So I wouldn't necessarily give up on the P3s, and I do think that that alternative funding could provide that balance that we need between the federal and state funding and coming from the private sector. Having said that, I still think that there are a lot of things that we can do internally through the federal government to.
So if I may, I've got one other question I want to ask, and Mr. Knockelman, since you're a small business owner and have a trucking industry, what else do you think we should be working on outside of transportation? My point to asking that question of Ms. Boger was to show that we all agree that there's an issue, we got to fix it. What we have a difference on is how we're going to pay for it, and that's for our T&I folks to figure out. But again, it's for us to point that out. What do you see quickly as some other opportunities or things that this committee should focus on in helping small businesses?
Thank you for the question. I think the other idea that you talked about it, a few members talked about it earlier, was innovation. What kind of ideas can be aggressively gone after, whether that be with special grants to evaluate how do we become more innovative in how we're moving people around our communities and businesses? Does it make it more efficient, and can we reduce cost, whether it be the capital cost and or the overall cost of operation of these, whether it be a P3 or otherwise? I think that we've got to be more innovative. And I think there's a lot of small businesses and a lot of young, innovative people in our colleges and in our communities who are willing to look at that in aggressive ways.
Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired, and now we recognize the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Golden, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just kind of following up on that conversation a little bit, I've become very familiar with public-private partnerships in Maine, and I think it's a new thing in Maine as well, ma'am. But served on the Transportation Committee in the Maine legislature, and I think we get a lot of good. We stretch our dollars nicely that way. But I do have a concern about that I want to keep in mind in this committee about the proposal that's come out of the administration for infrastructure, and that's simply to make sure that we don't leave some states behind, Maine being one of them, where we also have a state highway fund that's underwater, in many ways bonding our way out of it, which is almost like swiping a credit card to pay for basic maintenance, and it's not a good situation to be in. And when I hear, that we may have an infrastructure package that prioritizes those states that have more private resources, more state resources to put up and match, I'm fearful, of course, that those that just don't have the capital resources might get left out. So just, something that I'm going to be looking to make sure states like Maine don't get left behind. But on that, earlier we had a hearing where someone said one of the most important things we needed to do in an infrastructure package was make sure that the money got down to Main Street, and I'm sure that was a reference to businesses like your own. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to maybe talk a little bit about what we can do. I hear a lot of small business owners say it's tough for them to get involved with federal projects because it takes so long to actually get the shovels in the ground, and they just can't float the upfront costs. So if you could just maybe talk a little bit about that, and what can we do to speed up the process? Because in your testimony, you hinted at it a little bit.
Yeah, in my case, with an environmental firm that works with environmental permitting all the time, I can tell you that there are a lot of things that we can do within that process to make it more efficient. But like Mr. Knockelman referred to it being more efficient and being more innovative, is allowing those small businesses to come up with the ideas, and they can. They do this work all the time. We work on this. This is our bread and butter, and we can suggest ways to make it more efficient and innovative ways that may not be how it's been done for the last 50 years, but maybe a better way to do it, and now a way that belongs more to the more up to date. And I think our systems in terms of review process have been going around for many, many years, and we haven't really reconsidered whether or not they're still necessary. And whether or not we require as many days, and with all that we can do online, all that we can do very quickly, we're still keeping those same review times that we had back when we were using snail mail. And so that may not be necessary anymore. Just things like that is what I can think of the top of my head right now that we can, and small businesses can definitely help.
Period of time for review process is something that we should look at as an example.
Yes.
When you say getting small businesses more involved in the planning of projects, is that an issue with, let's say, working with state departments of transportation? Is that what you're saying? Is that the federal government should encourage more of a partnership in the planning process?
I think having a seat at the table early on, and it's not necessarily that they don't take it into account right now, but being able to say, and it's not necessarily so much about being a small business that can contribute, but being experts in the field. Our business right now is small because we are a specialty firm, and what we specialize on is environmental permitting and NEPA clearance. So we go out to the experts and ask them, how do you think it can be done more efficiently? That would be a suggestion.
Thank you. Mr. Donovan, I think I got time for one more exchange here. Something that happens in Maine a lot, and you talked about how coverage is overstated, and I couldn't agree with you more. Many a small town has some broadband running down Main Street, and it's they're doing a good job of rebuilding Main Street. They run out of space, though, and then growth is basically stuck, because when you talk to people, they'll say, yeah, it's nice on the downtown. We got good access to broadband or faster internet, but you get a mile out of town, and their consumers, their market is in the dark. So I just want to give you a chance maybe to talk about what Congress can do working with carriers to try and get at that problem right there, because I do think it's overstated. Maine, on the map here, said that 14%, only 14% are without access to broadband. There's no way that's true.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. And for where you're locating on Main Street, it's not just location, location, location. Now it's location, location, and is there broadband is what businesses are looking at, or else if you don't exist on there. Senator King uses the phrase that there's no silver bullet, but there is silver buckshot for solving this digital divide. So we want to embrace an all-the-above strategy.
The gentleman yields back, and now we recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Hagerton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Republican. I appreciate that. And witnesses, thanks for your testimony. One of the most important things that I'm trying to help accomplish is to sustain agriculture and our rural way of life, and a lot of that involves, of course, the success of small businesses. And I've come to the conclusion that the best way to level the playing field and to do all we can for our small businesses is to eliminate bad government at every level of government, especially here at the federal government. And when you look at areas like regulations and taxes, I think Obamacare, which hasn't been good for small business, and energy independence, things of that nature. We got a lot of work to do. Trade's another area, and I'd like to focus in, though, on transportation. In our district, southern Minnesota, a district goes all the way from South Dakota to Wisconsin and then Iowa up about 80 miles. There's a main thoroughfare, Highway 14. It's the most densely populated contiguous road without that doesn't include 4 lanes all the way across. And it has quite an impact on business and commerce and efficiency, and it all relates back to small business in our rural communities. I'll give you a little story. In the city of New Ulm, a beautiful community of about 14,000. It's in Brown County. Just a wonderful place. 3M's located there. Lots of good businesses. But the mayor and some of the economic development folks told me a story a year or two ago where there was a company that was looking to relocate into New Ulm, going to bring in 500 to 1,000 jobs. And the representative of that company drove in and looked around and said, "Is the only way in and out of town 2 lanes?" And they said, "Yeah, unfortunately, that's the way it is." And they said, "Okay, thanks." And they got back in their car and left. And so there's 500 or 1,000 jobs not in that wonderful, vibrant community that could even be stronger. And of course, that's a larger business. But think about what those folks are going to do if they live there, shop there, go to school there, how that helps all involved, especially small businesses. So I know my friend, Mr. Stauber, Congressman Stauber's on the committee, Transportation, looking to work with him and everyone else, because there's a project, Highway 14, that people, including my father 44 years ago when he arrived here, he started working on that, and we still haven't completed it. So I understand exactly how important infrastructure of that nature is. I'd say to our friend, Mr. Donovan, thank you for your staff for stopping by our office yesterday. We appreciate what you're doing and looking into in the issues. Do you have an example or two that you can provide us as to how broadband is so critically important for our farmers and our small agri businesses in places like southern Minnesota?
Sure, thank you. And so when we look at farming today, you almost become agricultural engineers with the amount of connectivity that they depend on. So precision agriculture techniques will allow farmers to be more efficient and have more profitable yields while using fewer resources. There's been a lot of talk of autonomous vehicles generally as things that 5G will enable. Well, we've had them in rural America for years. They're just John Deere green, as they're based on following that wireless connection in order to power how they are operating.
Thank you. I'll give you another example. I grew up on a grain and livestock farm. We had hogs, and my father would send me out on occasion to feed the hogs, but now they can do that all automatic. They sit in a computer room and turn the machines on and off, and nobody has to even get close to the animals in many cases.
I'll add on to that, if I may, that in addition to feeding them, you even have applications that are essentially a Fitbit for piglets that can track them and you can see where the animals are. And that actually, it helps prevent instances where the pigs get smothered while they're getting fed, other instances, and you can track the vitals. It's pretty incredible what you can do with these connections.
Very good. Very quickly, Ms. Williams, I ask you a quick question, your analysis. Do you support the Small Business Runway Extension Act of 2018, which affects small businesses and the qualifications during the procurement process? What's your opinion of that legislation?
Thanks for asking. I will have to say I'm not familiar with it. I haven't read that piece of legislation.
It's a relatively new bill, and I'm sorry if I caught you off guard, but maybe you can submit something for the record and respond to us down the road.
I'll be glad to do that.
With that, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back, and now we recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Vesey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As we talk about expanding our broadband and moving it out to rural America, one area that I'm concerned, and I'm fully supportive of that, I think is very important that we expand our broadband. One area that I think that we need to address now before we start any large, expansive movement of that is, when those contracting opportunities take place to help build out that broadband, that Black-owned, women-owned, minority-owned firms are a part of that work that actually takes place. I think that's critically important on everything that we do, for that matter, whether it's expanding our green infrastructure, or any of those things that we talk about that are on the horizon for helping create a better America. And so with that, I wanted to ask Ms. Williams, because I know that you have some background in helping out small businesses as it relates to expanding contracting opportunities for small businesses. Can you speak on how retainage and prompt pay affects the growth of small businesses and contractors, specifically when they're trying to be able to have enough capital to be able to work on various projects, different projects, if their money is being held up?
Thank you for that question. Great question. In my 30 years of experience in dealing with small businesses, not only through this program, but at the local level as well, all of those issues have been significant to small business growth. On local projects, retainage has definitely been an issue. Not only that, but bonding continues to be an issue, as well as prompt payment. That also relates to access to capital. That's one of the reasons why they need significant access to capital, is to be able to cover some of those expenses while they're waiting for payment. With federal government contracting, prompt payment continues to be an issue. We continue to see business after business come to us for assistance to find out where they can gain more access. Maybe they can, some of them tend to go to organizations where they submit their contract or borrow on their contract while they are waiting to get paid. So that continues to be an issue. We continue to look for resources to help them. Some local governments have put provisions in place to speed up that prompt payment process, but we haven't heard anything as far as expediting that at the federal level.
I know a local contractor in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that told me that they were owed about $600,000 on a project that they were working on, and literally did not get it for almost 9 months. And for a lot of small businesses, particularly smaller, Black-owned companies, Hispanic-owned companies, that could be really a death blow. What other challenges out there do small businesses face? Again, particularly, small minority-owned businesses face when working with the federal government on bids and projects?
Navigating through the system is a huge challenge. Again, a lot of them try to do it on their own before coming to resource providers. Having proper paperwork in place, having their business structures in place. So those areas continue to be an issue. Once they get those in place, then they can focus on actually providing the service. But it's navigating through the system continues to be an issue.
Madam Chair, yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and now we recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Staber, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for coming today. Your testimony is enlightening, because we're talking about small business owners. I'm a small business owner and have been for 28 years. We know, and the four of you know, that small businesses are the engine of our economy. A couple of questions. Ms. Williams, you talked about the question was, what's the biggest challenge for small business? And you talked about navigating, the system. I would encourage you, because you're the expert, to help us incorporate some of those suggestions from those small businesses so it can be easier. Because, I'm sure all of you understand that small businesses, we are assets to the federal government in repair, fixing their assets and what have you. And so I would encourage you to bring those forward. From your 30 years of experience, Ms. Williams, you can bring a wealth of expertise to that in the procurement process, because that's going to continue to expand our small businesses. That would be my request of you, because of your expertise. And when we talk about, my good colleague from Maine talks about expanding broadband in the rural areas, I couldn't agree with him more. And my area is rural northern Minnesota, beautiful place to live, but they're not expanding because, as you talked about, location, 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 broadband. That's an important piece of the infrastructure. Ms. Williams, your testimony, you concentrated in 3 areas of deploying broadband: availability, affordability, and adoption. Which of these do you think is the biggest challenge for small businesses?
Thank you so much, and I definitely will follow up with how we can help small businesses navigate through that. As far as broadband affordability, well, let me retract a little bit. I think accessibility is number one. Affordability, of course, definitely is number 2. And I say accessibility because there's a lot of, speaking from a Texas viewpoint, there's a lot of areas in South Texas where just municipalities, the small municipalities, are longing for access to high-speed broadband. We have an event called the Texas Rural Challenge where we meet with those municipalities, and we have directly heard that from them. So if the municipalities are having issues, the small business also in turn are having issues just accessing it in their area. There are pockets where you just can't get any cell phone service, let alone broadband service. So I would say the number 1 issue is accessibility.
Thank you. And then my next question would be, I guess, to the entire group. I'm on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and when we have to rebuild American roads and what have you, I would challenge us as supporters of small business to understand the importance of road access into our small businesses, and also to make sure that our State Department of Transportation understands when they rebuild or reroute that small businesses have a voice in that. And I would encourage us to get into, look at those projects that hopefully we'll be appropriating very soon, but that small businesses have a voice in the access roads, the frontage roads, whether they are going to bypass or not, but have that local input. And you folks are the experts to do it and help us move forward. I have one other question to Mr. Knuckleman. As a small business owner yourself, what areas do you think this committee should focus on in addition to infrastructure to help us flourish, help small businesses flourish?
Well, it's a great question, Congressman. I think that it all comes down to education and whether or not we, I think about the small business. I happen to have an accounting degree, so I think that it was very beneficial for me to go right into plumbing heating business, even though I don't install water heaters personally. I know I have people who do that. Education, so small, you don't need a 4-year degree to know how to be an entrepreneur. You don't need a 4-year degree to be a good business person. But I think the communities need access to those business ideas, and whether or not we encourage the educational system to include it at a high school level, and after high school, as well as having in the region the ability for people to come and get their quick answers. How do you start and grow your small business? That's a huge issue, and it's not very expensive.
I appreciate that answer. That was music to my ears. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and now I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes, and we're going to go into a second round. And to follow the line of questioning of the gentleman that just was asking the questions, I would like to raise. So imagine for a second here that we're going to enact legislation, an infrastructure bill, and so it seems like there is bipartisan desire to enact such legislation. The question is, how are we going to pay for it? I am optimistic when I hear Mr. Knuckleman to say that a gas tax, and many of those many people are proposing such a tax increase to be able to finance it. But let's say for a moment that there is bipartisan support and that we enact the legislation. Ms. Bucher, you mentioned how a shortage of skilled workers constrain the ability of small businesses to expand operations. What would you say, Mr. Donovan, Mr. Knuckleman, and Ms. Bucher? How can talk to us about the workforce challenges that you will face if such a legislation is enacted? Mr. Donovan.
Thank you. We encourage your efforts to enact legislation and stand ready to assist in that. On the workforce piece, there was bipartisan legislation last Congress we'd like to see come back on looking at, particularly in the telecommunications world, at tower climbing and other tower engineering jobs, on bringing that more into community colleges and into local communities so that you can start using additional resources to make sure that the people have the skills to work on broadband deployment to accomplish the goals that you will have in the infrastructure bill.
Ms. Boer.
So I have a short term and a long term for that answer to that question. The short term, it's the lack of engineers. We would have to go back to high school. We would have to convince these kids to go to engineering school, and that's something that is going to take time. So in the short term, I would think a cross-training program where engineers that may not be as familiar with the different areas of, there's a structural engineer, there's very specific fields within the engineering field that we can help cross-train now, start that process now, especially with our entry-level engineers, so we can have a more diverse set of talents within the same engineer. That, in my opinion, would be a short-term, we can work on it now solution. But the long-term and most sustainable solution would have to be going to workforce development that starts at I would even say at the middle school level, not just at the college level. I think in college we're a little too late. So I would say we would have to, that K to 12 is important.
Thank you. Mr. Knuckleman.
Thank you, and I would agree with everything that's been stated on that. And I think another area is that, and you see a shift in the culture, I think, of a discussion about that not everyone also needs to have a four-year degree and take on a lot of debt to be able to be successful, work as in the workforce environment. I think that's very healthy, and we need to encourage that. We've been drawing in our business, we've been drawing in a lot of individuals who are both college educated and not in the service industry. So we've been going to all fields, including encourage co-oping from high schools, seniors who come in and work half a day paid, and be able to feel the industry out to know whether or not they're going to be able to do that. But I also think it's a reality that the public is also willing to pay for infrastructure too, because ultimately, as much as I would like to think that it all comes out of my pocket, ultimately I have to pass those costs on to consumers, and I think they're willing to pay for good services and good roads and infrastructure.
Thank you. And so I yield back the balance of my time. I would like to recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Joyce, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairwoman for yielding. My question is for Mr. Donovan. What can we do to incentivize better relationships between providers and state, city, and local governments who have experienced limited coverage? I'm from rural South Central Pennsylvania, and many of these municipalities are hesitant to share the control with any other existing infrastructure.
Thank you for the question. I think part of this is, part of the discussion today is we have bipartisan agreement that access to broadband is an economic multiplier and a must-have in the 21st century. It's as we look at the permitting process, the application, rights of way, it's looking at it as a partnership that's a win-win. It's an investment in the local community, and maybe looking a little less at it being a one-time revenue generator off of different fees and different access, and instead taking a step back and looking at all the revenue that will come to that area because the investment is flowing in there. The investment, wireless carriers are continuing to work to expand networks, and more of that attention is going to go where they're able to have a municipality that can work with them to try and find some creative solutions, particularly for the small carriers that I represent. They also live in these communities, and if they don't do something right by their community, they're going to hear about it. They're serving on local boards, so I think they might be some of the model on how you can work to improve these relationships to make sure we can get to that goal of expanded service.
Do you see a role in incentivizing these entities to work together?
Absolutely. I think any incentives you can have to spur additional deployment are great, and we've seen that already in some states that have eased restrictions on small cells are some of the first 5G cities. So how we look at those incentives to make sure that carriers can work with the municipalities to make sure we expand service.
Thank you for your concise answer. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and now we recognize the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Golden, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, ma'am. Not to pick on you, Mr. Donovan, but we'll just keep going with this one, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on some of the regulatory stuff that might help in rural areas. I think that's been a good conversation. I just wanted to ask, getting back, I love your response about the buckshot, by the way. It sounds very much like Senator King. And as a Mainer, I understand the reference. But do you foresee a time where carriers that you represent and others are going to see that it's a good investment for them to expand significantly without public assistance, or are we just going to? I mean, consumers I think are going to have to either accept that they're not going to have it, or are we going to have to do some kind of federal investment in the infrastructure or public partnerships? I mean, in the state of Maine, they've looked at doing bonds related to this to lay down the infrastructure so that carriers can then provide the service. But, I mean, do we realistically think that carriers will ever see a financial incentive to do this without public investment?
Congressman, thank you. Yes, we do, and it's part of the exciting part of 5G deployment is that in many ways it's going to affect everything other than your phone first. Yes, you'll have faster speeds and greater access, but the connections that it enable can set up a river of pennies where you may not have as many data plans sold to people, but you have additional sensors and other data plans that ride on that, powered through 5G networks or some of the precursors like narrowband Internet of Things networks. As one example, we represent a carrier that serves rural Wyoming, and they have a massive footprint, but less than 100,000 subscribers. Talking with them, they said they've identified another 5 million subscribers. The difference is that 3 million are cows and 2 million are sheep. So how can you get those connected as well? And once you build that network, and we may need some additional support to get the networks built, but then can you use that river of pennies approach to have many different streams that can help build a sustainable business case?
So what you're basically saying is if we do nothing, your belief is carriers are going to bring 5G access out to rural America by themselves.
Parts will. I think if we do nothing, then we're on the wrong side of the digital divide right now, and we need to build that bridge. Once we get there, then they can sustain the businesses, but we do need additional support in order to get that initial build out.
Gotcha. The infrastructure part.
That's correct.
All right. Thank you. Ms. Williams, just really quickly, you talked earlier about how some small businesses are going out and getting, some people to come in and advise them how to do, get in on federal contracting and other things, and that's essentially what the PTAC is for. And I've seen this firsthand where we had a PTAC in Bangor, Maine, and 30 miles down the road, a small business that was paying some advisor consultant to come in from as far away as Boston on how they could get involved with pursuing some contracting opportunities relevant to their shipbuilding. I mean, obviously, the contractor, the advisor is putting money into getting word out there and pursuing clients. What's it going to take for PTACs to compete against that? I mean, what are you lacking, in terms of getting the word out about the services that you offer and then getting in touch with those businesses? Because I can't help but feel like, in the case I just described, they'd love to have a supported service through PTAC rather than paying some expensive consultant out of Boston.
Right, you're absolutely right. We come into scenarios every day where businesses want to get on the GSA schedule, General Services Administration. They've already paid a consultant $9,000 and still didn't get on the schedule. They'll come to a PTAC and get on the schedule in a matter of 2 months. I think one of the things that's lacking is just advertisement. As you mentioned, a lot of the consultants put money into advertising, and the way they advertise it, it makes it seem like they are federally connected. I came across one that actually used federal logos without permission, but because a lot of the funds that we get have to be put into services instead of advertising, then that's where we can't compete with private consultants.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back, and now we recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes, Mr. Shabbat.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I think I'm the last questioner, if I'm not mistaken here, so I'm the only one that's standing between the folks in this room and lunch, so I'll be brief. So I'll go to the Brent Spence Bridge and Judge Knockelman here. When we had Elaine Chow, the head of the Transportation Department in Cincinnati, had a hearing with the local chamber folks from Kentucky and Ohio and talked about principally the Brent Spence Bridge, but also the Western Hills Viaduct, which is another infrastructure project we're working on in our area. And she mentioned something that Ms. Bogert talked about here for a while, and that was public-private partnerships. With respect to local, especially the Brent Spence Bridge, do you have any thoughts on that area where that might come into play on those two particular projects, either one or both?
Sure. Well, I think that it's been proven that P3s can be done well and they can be done extremely poorly. And it seems as though that I think that that's going to have to be something that is on the table for both the projects that you referred to. And I know that Governor Bevin has said the same thing, that they have to be talked about. We've got some issues, as you are probably aware of, in Kentucky with some legislation that local or state legislation that has been problematic on the Brent Spence project. But in terms of, I think that what I've seen from the outside and all the reading that I've done and the advocates and opponents of it have realized that the sophistication on the capital side has got to be balanced so that you don't have the state in a situation, either state in a situation where the liability's there and the private sector has no liability, or that the freedom by which they are able to set rates and et cetera really damage the state financial situation. So I think that it's all about balance, it's about accountability, it's about real return, and making sure that no one is too the risk side of it is balanced with the capital investment, and I think that we've got to have it on the table.
Thank you. And then finally, you mentioned a potential gas tax. The chair did as well, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that a former member of the House, former United States Senator, is now our new governor in Ohio, and that's Mike DeWine, and he has brought that up. That issue, controversial, but he's brought it up, put it on the table. We don't know what the legislature will do with it. That's in Columbus, but he has, at least it's out there, and we'll see where that goes. But sort of related to that in some ways, and I had mentioned this relative to the Brent Spence Bridge, that we do have this projects of national and regional significance that's waiting there, but it's waiting for the local folks to determine how they're going to pay for the local share. And maybe that's part of it. And I know that our new Governor DeWine and Governor Bevin from Kentucky are going to be talking about funding for this major project. Do you have any thoughts on the local funding aspects of the Brent Spence Bridge, what you're hearing now or what you think about that, however you'd like to comment?
Sure, and I think the big discussion has been about tolls for us, as you know, in the region, and I think whether or not that is a contribution from the state or the state has to set that financing model up. While no one likes to pay it, I'll speak only as a business owner and not as my elected official position, because I can only speak for myself. I think those, again, are costs that have to be balanced out. And if it's reasonable, I think very, very willing to pay those kind of contributions that are made on the local level to get those projects done. And I will tell you, from the community in general, I have sensed a willingness to be willing to step up to the plate and play a part in that, in making sure that local dollars are invested in those kind of projects. So I think that the movement, we just have to kind of, now that there's been a groundswell of support for saying we know we've got a major problem, it's going to take dollars. You all don't have magical checkbooks to write on any project around the country, that we're all going to have to be reasonable about the fact we're going to have to step up to the table and make some investments. And I think there's a willingness to do that. I really do.
Thank you very much. I'd like to compliment the panel for, I think, excellent testimony. I want to compliment you, Madam Chair. This was a very good hearing. Thank you for pulling it together, and I yield back.
And now you're on the record supporting a tax increase.
I have to correct the record. I am not on the record doing that.
So I echo the ranking member statement regarding your participation is very enlightening, and we really thank you because we know that you are all very busy people and you are here today. It's very important for this committee. Ensuring small firms can participate in the federal marketplace and win a greater share of federal work is always top of mind. And as we have heard today, investment in our crumbling infrastructure are a great opportunity to help small businesses grow in every corner of our country. As we discuss any future infrastructure investments, it is critical that we listen to and prioritize small business needs to ensure their future success. I will ask unanimous consent that members have 5 legislative days to submit statement and supporting materials for the record without objection, so ordered. And if there is no further business to come before the committee, we are adjourned. Thank you. Thank you.
Maury.
Spread out too, so who knows how this will end up.
I have it.